Today we're going to walk through the install of your Pro R EXR fuel tank. We're going to start with disassembly. That'll be skid plates, seats, trim, and the batteries. We'll move on to the installation, which is going to be the battery box, the tanks itself, wiring harness, and the plumbing. Now for this job, it's best to clear an afternoon so you don't feel rushed in any of the steps. You're also going to want to take the instructions that came with your kit and reference those because it's going to tell you the tools needed and it's going to give you helpful tips and notes along the way. All right, well, let's get started. Okay, we'll start with the dirtiest job first. That's getting the skid plate off. Two quick points here. You'll notice I have a box. As we go through this job, being really organized with your hardware is going to be key to this thing running smooth. So whether that is a container for each step along the way, or Tupperware, or bags, or cardboard, you want to come up with a system that works for you and it's going to make this really easy to go back together. That way you don't have to remember every single detail. Okay, with all the bolts out of the front skid, there's going to be two clamps that are pinching the chassis tubes, one here and one here. You're just going to want to pull down, kind of prevent it from smashing your face. Front skid is off. Slide that guy out of your life. You're going to want to pull the middle skid off as well. That way you have access to the compartment under the driver's seats. So on the mid skid, it's a little bit bigger, a little bit more unruly. I generally leave one center bolt in. That way this whole thing's not falling on my face. You get all the other hardware out. And then you'll notice your car has a couple flaps here that connect the mid to the rear skid. Once you get this last bolt out, you kind of have to work around those. And all that is just slide the skid plate backwards and it'll drop out from under that. The reason I mention that now is because when you come back in, it's important to remember to start with the skid plate further back and then bring it forward again. Otherwise, you're going to fight these two flaps and you're going to be yelling at me. So there's that quick tip. Now that we're done underneath with all the dirty stuff, we can go up top and get to the rest of the job. One quick thing I should have said, this car is new, so I was able to avoid it. But for your car, if you have miles on it, make sure to wear safety glasses when you're under there. As you're pulling the skids, there's going to be dirt and debris falling. And the last thing you want to do is get a bunch of stuff in your eye right at the start of this job. So safety glasses, kids. Okay, now we're going to move to the driver's seat area. We are going to grab a handful of tools. You will be able to find the list of these tools in the instructions. Skid plate hardware set in a good place so you don't knock it over. Organization is key. All right, what we're going to do here is we have to remove the seat belts in order to get the seat out. And then once we do that, we're going to move into the battery tray and all the stuff in this corner. So we'll jump in with the seat belts first. With the seat belts, I always like to put the hardware back in the belt. That way you know where the stuff comes from. I'm going to loosen that. unclip the seat and pull it back a bit. That's going to give us access to the inside. Taking off the bolts for the height adjustment. And in case you don't know this, your car actually has 3 height adjustment holes. So you can actually move or tilt your seat to whatever desired position you want. Those bolts come out just like we did underneath. We need somewhere to keep our hardware. In this case, we're just using a little bucket because we've done this a couple times. Again, you can use bags, Tupperware, cardboard. Hey Max, don't we have a quick tip we can like show somewhere?
Yeah, we can link it.
Awesome. That way they can see a little bit more about that. All right, with the adjusters out, now we can lift up. That gives us access to the front seat belt, waist strap anchors. You know what? Let's supercharge this. And again, whenever possible, try to put hardware or matching components back together. That way you don't have to remember as much. Okay. We'll tilt the seat back in. There is an electrical connector on the driver's belt. Disconnect that at the center console. And then we just need to grab the rear, or I should say the inside seatbelt harness bolt. And just like the outside one, we're going to put the hardware back in it. That way we don't have to remember where it goes. With both disconnected, now we can feed them through the seat back. And remove the seat. With that stuff out of the way, now we're able to get to the seat frame bolts, as well as the seat belt retractor bolts to get that stuff loosened up. Two in the front, two in the back. Again, nuts and bolts always going back together. You can put these back into the components too, if you want, to help you remember. Switch over to our Torx. This guy will slide out from under. I just leave the hardware in there. Goes into our bin. And then this part's going to help you a bunch. When you remove the retractor, the only way that this will extend is when the retractor is sitting vertical or in the upright position. If you move this any other direction, your belt's locked. So the key thing here is we're going to take this and place it in the back seat so it's out of our way. we want to make sure we have lots of slack. If you let this thing come all the way back here and then you store it, there's no way to retract it. So make sure you're vertical, make sure you have lots of slack. Set it back here with all kinds of extra room. That's going to help you a bunch later because we're going to end up moving this seat frame up. You may need to wiggle that, and if this is too tight, that's not going to be possible. So that's out of the way. We've given ourselves a bunch of room. We've pulled that off. We pulled these guys off. We pulled this off. We're now ready to take the center bolts out here, and then we're going to move to the back seat area. So depending on when your car was made, these are either going to be torque bolts, or I should say torque screws, or they're going to be these bolts. Looks like Polaris used both. So that's disconnected. The connector for your driver's seat belt, we'll slide that off now since we're here anyways. Okay, that's about as far as we can go here. Yeah. We will move to the back seat and keep rolling. Driver's rear seat area. Got myself another hardware cubby. I want to start again by removing the seat. Rear seats come out by reaching in between the two openings here, and there's a handle. Squeeze that handle, it's going to release the backrest. Backrest out. Lower seat cushion just lifts up and folds forward. Same thing on the passenger side. Release. Backrest comes out. Seat folds forward. Okay. Get the engine cover off. Top panel comes out first. Then the bottom. We'll disconnect all the front waist belt straps, and that's just a clip to disconnect it from the hoops. Get these out of our way. I like to tuck this stuff back. You can zip tie back, you can just tuck it into the engine if you want, but the more clear the workspace, the easier it is to do the future steps. Okay, with that out, we're going to pull the felt quarter panels out. Panel popper, we get each one of the rivets out. There's going to be 3 along the inside and then 2 on the outside here. We'll stick those in our little storage bin. This guy comes out. For all these, I find it really nice to use the bed. Easy access, you're not tripping over it. And now we pull all of the Torx bits out of the under seat panel. One thing that you'll notice, and I'll just pull this one out to show you. This left rear is a shorter Torx than all the others. So when you end up with all these in a pile, and all of them look this long, except for this guy came from this back corner. Just so you know. Okay. We'll grab this while we're here. Little trim piece on the back of the under seat trim. You wiggle and pulls out. Now this guy snaps in and lays in both on top of the trim, but you'll notice it also has tabs that go under. So as you're feeding this back in, I'll just tell you now since we're here. When you go back together, you start in the center by getting these guys to lay over the top. And then on the end, you're going to get that tab that's underneath fed in. And you're going to notice this tab has to be, you have to push forward so this tab interlocks with this. Once you have one side done, you just repeat the same thing on the other side by making sure the tab underneath here finds its way under. And then the last thing you do is push it forward and clip it into place. So, not hard at all. Just something to pay attention to when you are going back together. Into the back with that. Okay, we can transfer over to the other side quickly to pull the other felt out. And then we'll come right back here. We get this felt quarter panel out the same way. Okay. With all the trim out of the way, we can lift up and pull the under seat trim off. Now what I've noticed, it's always easier to pull the passenger side out first. Get that free. And then the trim generally ends up getting stuck down in this corner between the seatbelt bracket and this trim piece. So that's kind of a lift up and then wiggle towards the center of the car to get it out. All right, with that out, now we have access to the compartment where the battery relocation tray is going to go. We are going to want to pull the bolts out that hold this seat cushion in place so we can make room to get the tray in. Now these bolts on the pivot bracket are going to get exchanged for longer ones that come in the kit because we'll be changing this part out. So these guys you can set aside, they're not going to be needed anymore. We'll set this guy down outside the car. Knowing that we need to change those pivot brackets during the install. Okay, those two are out. The last thing we need to do to prep this corner is to pull the back bolt out to make room for the tray to drop in. We're going to need some larger hardware for that. Oh. Not back on, just so we keep everybody together. And now while we're here, we will use the panel popper again to remove the rivets in the rear center console, because that'll be coming out here shortly. That is free. That corner is ready for install. Let's move. Over in this corner, excuse me, we can pull the trim off the rear of the center console. And if you can't get your hands in the top, putting the panel popper or screwdriver in here works too. Just be real careful as you pry so you don't mar your center console. You can see what's holding it together on the backside. It's just a series of clips. Those index into these 5 points. So a little bit of tug and this thing generally comes out. Set that down there. Okay. Now that we are here, we're going to pull the filler neck out so that that is ready to be replaced, and then move to the front seat. Okay. Pretty simple, just loosening the 2 hose clamps. You can get away with not even taking this off. Well, we'll show you what's going on. So inside here, the gas cap is attached by a tether to the filler neck. You don't need to pull this off. You just get this guy loose so the gasket is able to be removed. And then we can wiggle this whole thing out as an assembly. Boom. Complete assembly, that way you don't have to remove this. These hose clamps we're going to reuse. This we are not, so this can go with the 2 bolts that we got rid of the other side and wherever you want to go. We'll set that guy aside for the moment. Replace that during install. One of the other decisions you're going to have to make, and we can talk about it now, is right inside here, now that we have the neck out, you can see this restrictor. This restrictor is to help from overfilling and also, I think, messing up the evap system. What we found, if you are a very responsible individual, you can remove this. It will allow you to fill your car from the gas pump much faster, but you cannot overfill your tank. So with this, it kind of helps prevent that. If you take this out, you get way more performance, but you have to be very careful not to overfill your tank. So I'm gonna leave that one to you. We're gonna pull this out. And then what we are gonna do, just so we don't cause any issues, is grab a rag, stick it in the top of the gas tank. That way, no accidental bad things happen. It is going to be way easier if we do a couple more things in the back. So the things we want to do before we leave here, we want to get the other rivets out of the center console on this side. We want to get the rear, or I should say the inside passenger seatbelt bracket hardware unscrewed. That thing. Put that in there. With this guy out, now you can access that back, I don't know if you can see it, that back hardware on the center console. And what that is going to do by taking that out now is it's going to allow us to remove the rear center console while we're here. Get everything out of the way. Easiest way that I've found to do this is to start in the rear. So we're going to come up and we're going to push forward. And you're going to notice we're hitting on the seatbelt anchors. It's just a lift up, and it generally comes out really easy. Once you're up here, now as you lift, you're coming backwards. That way you clear the hardware for the front seatbelt anchors. This guy's out. You can go live in the back of the car for the moment. And we can make our way to the front. And this is just a repeat of what we did on the driver's seat. We'll loosen that. Seatbelt out. Release the seat. Again, handle that's under the front of the seat, squeeze up, and then I'm pulling on the back of the seat. Move this out of the way enough that I can get to those adjuster bolts again. Get ourselves a container for hardware here. Those out, we can lift up on the adjuster. Get to those anchor bolts. Feed the seat belts through. And seat out. Okay. Seat is out. We're doing the same thing we did on the driver's side again. This should be nice and familiar. All four seat bolt frame, seat frame bolt? All four seat frame bolts out. With those out, move on to the adjuster, or I should say the seat belt retractor. Torques on top to get that guide off again. Hardware back in place. And like we did on the driver's side, giving ourselves lots of slack here. So we got room to play with it if we need. Okay. With that out, now we have access to the passenger side of the center console. We'll take all those trim bolts out. And unlike the driver's side, we're going to continue down the front and pull the remaining 4 bolts out here. Again, depending on your car, it's either going to be bolts like this or it's going to be Torx. With those out, we have 1 plastic rivet here. Okay. Bitchin', that is loose, that is loose. And now, by feel, you're going to notice there's 1 more plastic rivet on the back side of this panel where I'm pointing, and then one a little bit further down, you'll be able to feel it right here. So we're going to pull both those out. One. There's a wiring harness in there. You may have to push out of the way a little bit to get the top one. And 2. Okay, one other key thing to note is there is a small light that's clipped into this side panel here so that you have a footwell light at night. When we remove this, we're going to pop this out. I'll show you how to get that back in quickly so you know when you're doing the install. So with this, we pull out on the bottom of the trim piece first. With the bottom removed, it's going to walk itself out of the top without you having to do much of anything. Cool. Now that guy doesn't need to completely come out of the car just yet, but we want to have that loose because that gives us a little bit of extra room to go in and get the next 2 bolts for the seat frame. So to access those bolts, the first thing we got to do is remove, or I should say loosen, one of these hose clamps. And then wiggle up on the intake duct. That gives us just a bit of extra breathing room there. It's actually going to be easier to access this hardware now from the back seat. So what we're going to do is reach in under the intake duct and under this rear crossbar for the seat frame bracket. Go up in and we're going to feel for these 2 bolts here. Get the nut off the first one. Nut off the second one. And now if we wiggle the frame a little bit, we should be able to get the bolts out. There, both bolts are out. Like always, we want to put the nuts back on so we know what goes to what. Now another tip, when you're going back together after you've done the install, you want to put these 2 bolts in. Don't tighten them, but put these 2 bolts into there first, because it's going to allow you, with everything else loose, to use the frame again to help find the hole and wiggle in. And if you got a friend, this step when you're going back together ends up being much, much easier with 2 people. So, okay, with that done, now the seat frame is completely loose. We can take the seat frame, slide it back so it's just past the mounting tabs it's on, and then tilt it vertical. And it'll live right there for the rest of the install. Okay, now we got access to the batteries. With that uncovered, we're going to finish taking the trim off and the batteries out here. I'm going to make my life easy and pull that center console piece out right now. And if you look in here, you can see that, Max, the wiring harness and the connector. So this guy, you just give a little wiggle and it's going to pop out. It snaps back in the same way. So be gentle with it. That way none of the locks break off and it'll just push back in really easily. All right. Let's start with the battery. Now, all of the hardware that we're going to be taking off from this area, we do not want to put in with the rest of our hardware from this corner because none of this hardware is going to get reused. So we're going to take all of this stuff and set it aside with the filler hose and the pivot bracket bolts in our don't need it pile. Ground bolt off. Again, hardware back in so we don't lose it. Power loose. Bolt back in. And then for safety, because we don't have the driver's battery disconnected, you can either tape the face of this, or what I do is just put the cover back over it. That way there's a little bit of insulation just in case it touches the ground. Battery comes out. Gonna remove the anchors for the harness. Loosen the ground strap up. Now we are gonna reuse this piece when we move the battery box, so you do wanna hold on to that. But we are not gonna reuse the nut and stud that hold it to the car, so both of those can come out. Same thing with all this stuff. We're just going to throw it in the old battery tray. Okay, with all those loose, we need to pull this trim so we can get this guy out. We are keeping this hardware, so it's going to go in with the rest of our stuff. Now, if you get to this point and this thing's not coming out and you're wondering what the heck's going on, Polaris did us dirty. There is actually one more bolt inside, or one more screw, I should say, inside here. You can generally get to it without having to pull the entire door sill off by just lifting up here, prying out on that just the tiniest little bit, and getting that guy out. Now this, along with these, will not be needed, so that's going to go back in there. We'll disconnect the rear light anchor that's holding on to this guy. And now this trim will slide towards the center of the car and back. Come out, and this can go with the rest of the stuff that's getting discarded. Or saved. That's the nice part about this kit. If you decide to take the kit out, put the car back to stock, hold on to all that stuff because it'll go right back in. We're not cutting or modifying the chassis at all. All right, with that out, we'll push the power cable with the grommet back through the box. And remember, this is still connected to power over there. So whether you've taped it or you've covered it, you do not want this to touch the chassis because it's still live. Set that guy down. Discard that. And we are ready to go to that side. Again, battery strap we're not going to need. We'll set that over with the rest here in a minute. All right, battery is out of the way. Okay, now the batteries are disconnected. Everybody's safe. Again, we disconnect all the anchors that are holding the cables to the battery box. Remove the ground strap. Nut. Just like the passenger side, we are reusing this, so you want to save this. And just in case you're putting this all in one spot, the driver's side is the shorter of the two ground straps. That'll matter here in a few minutes when we're putting these cables back on the batteries and into the battery relocation tray. Okay, those guys are loose. Ground strap is loose. Let's get that stud out of here. Stud is removed. Now I want to remove the rest of the stuff so we can get the trim out. We don't want these two. Those need to go away. Otherwise, you're going to end up with 2 extra bolts here. You're going to be wondering what the heck you missed. And again, we're lifting this thing up to get to the super secret bolt. Don't need that. Okay. Panel popper. And now, connector for the rear light, or I should say anchor. Oh, look at that little guy. Here's a quickie. You got to lift up here because it gets locked on this little amazing tab. There it goes. That slides out. All this goes into the keep for a rainy day box. 3 more bolts inside here. Well, 3 more screws. That is free. Positive cable out. Negative cable out. Negative is the one in the harness. Now you're going to notice you have a 300 amp inline fuse here, and it doesn't want to leave the box. What we need to do there is take a small section out of the top of this here so that we're able to pass this through. And that's just a pair of dikes. I try to cut as little as possible. That way, if you do go back in as stock, you're not really losing any function here, and the seal still works. So with a single cut, you should be able to spread the box enough to get the wire through, and then this goes away. Next, we'll cut the zip ties holding the battery cable that goes from the driver's side to the passenger side. There it is. And feed that out. You will not need this cable again, so it can go with the rest of the parts in our discard pile. And that's it for general disassembly. Now that we got that done, we are going to move on to the assembly steps. And we'll start right here at the driver's seat. Let's jump in. One and two. To start off assembly, we need to move the brake line out of the way. We're going to be removing this bolt. And then we're going to sand that surface because we're actually relocating the battery ground to right there. You can do this with sandpaper, or if you have access to some kind of grinder, that always helps. And we're just clearing it right around the bolt. We don't want a big old surface. That'll be just enough. The hardware goes back in. Tighten in place. Reinstall the brake line there. Now you got a good ground. So after you've installed the ground, we want to trim the drive shaft tunnel here to make room for the breather or the balance tube that's going to go between the driver and the passenger tank. To do that, we want to cut this zip tie. We'll move the harness down. And then we are trimming these 3 sections out from here to here. Okay, section removed. If you have the ability It's always a good idea to kind of sand these corners. That way, if you're ever in here repairing anything else, there's no chance of kind of catching yourself on any of these. That can be done with a sander or like a pair of flush cuts or a file. Okay. Sharp edges trimmed. Now let's move the battery cable. Next, we want to take that positive lead that's coming from the back of the chassis. Cut that first zip tie. Might be able to see it in there. There's a few little clips that are attaching the battery cable to the transmission tunnel. These little guys. Just disconnect those. And feed this thing backwards. Grab one of the zip ties from the kit. We'll remove the rest of this guy, the one that we cut off from earlier. In that same place on the white strap, we're going to secure the harness to this brace. Okay, now we got to do a quick prep on the driver's tank before we put it in. That includes taking one of the couplings from the kit, sliding it over the nipple on the inside, taking the balance tube, installing that. And here I've bottomed out. That way you have a ton of room on the passenger side. We're going to install these so we can actually get to them easily once it's in the car. That way, if we need to service the tanks or the car, we're not creating extra work for ourselves. We're going to tighten the inside hose clamp all the way. We're going to snug this down, but we want to leave it a little bit loose. That way we can adjust this between the right and left side tanks. And then again, make sure that the hose from inside this tank is passing through. This is actually the hose that the driver's pump is sending fuel through to empty into the passenger tank. So super important that is protruding a couple inches out. Okay, this stuff's tight. We can drop this in the car. You're going to tilt down pipe going in first. And be real patient with this. If you kind of wiggle this into place, it doesn't take a whole bunch of effort. And that is installed. We'll lay the driver's side strap over the tank for now, so that's done. And we can move on to building the battery relocation tray. So for the battery relocation tray, you'll have your J-hooks, your hold down, a jumper lead, and then the box itself. We are going to take and install the batteries. Make sure we get the hooks in there. Those pass into the holes on either face. And you'll notice that we're placing the terminals opposite the switch. Very important orientation, and you'll see why here in a second. Then we'll install the battery hold down. Make sure the foam is facing down so that we're insulating the strap from the battery. And before we tighten down the nuts, we want to make sure to push the batteries all the way forward into the travel stop that's in the battery tray, like that. Snug the hardware down evenly. That way we don't end up with one of these bolts with like an inch of thread and the other one has none. And then you can apply a ton of torque. All we're trying to do is make sure that when you wrench on this, it doesn't move. So we can see this side needs a little bit more. Just be careful not to put so much in here that you end up damaging the battery. So that is now tight and secure. We can move on to installing the ground straps. Now we're not going to install the power straps because then that would make this entire unit live and it could short to itself. With the batteries installed and tight, we're going to move on to the ground cables. We're going to start with the inside battery, and this is inside as it's sitting in the car, and install the passenger side ground, or the longer of the two grounds, on that battery. And the shorter of the two grounds, we'll put on the outside battery. Right now I'm leaving everything loose so we can connect both ends and then we'll tighten. There. We're going to route this cable down into the chassis. Bolt comes from the outside of the box in. And then on this ground, we're just going to loop it back over. Washer, nuts. And tighten those in place. With that guy tight, tighten the terminals. Okay, double check, tight, tight, tight. Now remember, these are still positive terminals and they're hot, so be careful when you're doing all this stuff. Okay, like I said, we're not going to connect this until we put all this in the car. We got our ground side done. We can move this whole program back to the car and set it in place. One thing I should say is this has a little bit of weight to it. So if you got a bad back or you don't want to pick up heavy loads, you can actually do this install in the car. I just like doing it this way so it's at a higher height and we have a little bit more room to move the box around. So before we drop it in, we're going to rest it on the frame and on the stock tank so that we can connect the factory positive cable to the integrated switch. So I'll grab this stuff so we can do that. At the time we're making this video, you will have to do this next step, which is to drill out, or I should say drill up this hole to 3/8 to accommodate the battery switch. Now we are working on another solution. So if you're watching this in the future, check your instructions because you may not need to do this step. Next, we're going to take the bend out of this. And install this guy onto the underside of the battery switch. Now, before we tighten that all the way, we want to put a little bit of Loctite on there. So that we have some vibration resistance. Now, as you continue to tighten, you are going to flatten the plug. That is totally normal. We're going to make sure that this lead is bent down and clear of any hardware. We don't want any shorting to ground. Double check that that's tight. Then we're going to take the stock boot that was already on the harness and feed that over everything to insulate this from the chassis. Grab another zip tie from the kit, and we're going to zip tie the two leads together. That way we create a strain relief on the chassis cable. Keeping the load off of the end here. Trim that. Okay, the last thing we need to do before we drop this in the car is we are going to need to sand the surface here where that rear bolt passes in, because this is going to be how the ground from the relocation battery tray finds its way back to the chassis. Doesn't have to be a ton of surface. You just want to make sure that you get all the way down to the bare metal so that we get a good ground between the battery box and the car. All right, with our factory power lead run, zip tied in place, connected to the switch, boot installed, and strain relief done, face sanded, we can drop the battery tray into place. The battery tray in place, we can start putting everything back together. There it is. Nut on the back. That's tight. That's secured. Remember, we are connected to power now, so we want to be real careful with these ends as we're connecting everything up. Nice and secure. Please, please keep in mind, this is hot and everything else is ground, so as you're using a ratchet or a wrench, do not let it touch anything while you are tightening on the positive cables. That's tight, this is still loose. There we go. Now we're nice and tight. Shield both of those with the supplied boots. Okay, all that stuff is covered and insulated. Double check that we're tight, 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 tight. Now we can move on to updating the pivot brackets on the rear seat cushion. Now we need to replace the rear seat pivots. We're going from the stock short length pivot to a longer length aftermarket pivot. To do that, we'll get a screwdriver or a pair of pliers in to remove the E-clips. Make sure you hold on to these things. Because they are a spring, when you pull them off, they can go flying. So super important to be really gentle as you remove them. Okay, second one is off. And you'll notice these don't just press out. These are the pins. They're keyed into this. So you're going to have to take a hammer and then a punch and a hammer. There you go. Knock those free to get the old pivot bolts out. Came out pretty easy. Okay, with those out, we can install the new ones. Now, just in case we didn't take note of which way this goes, we want to have the flat face on the tab facing towards the cover. So as we're putting this on, this is the front of the seat cushion. Each one of the legs is facing towards the front, flat face facing towards the plastic. And like we saw, these pins come from the center of the seat and go outward. So we're going to do that on both. Center of the seat going outward. Take our hammer, tap these guys back in. E-clip back on. Might need a little persuasion. Same thing here. E-clip back on. Little persuasion. Okay, now these are installed. Grab the two 60 millimeter or longer bolts out of the kit. That's what we're going to use here. We can go install this in the car. Now we install the cushion back in the car. Nuts back on. And tighten in place. Double check function. So good. Got our battery box installed. We got all our wires tight. We have our lower seat cushion on. We can move from here to the passenger rear and do the filler neck. Here we want to get our hose clamps off of the factory setup. This guy can go into your discard pile. Move the rag that we placed earlier. And install our adapter filler neck. That gets pushed all the way down. Make sure the clocking is such that you don't have a hard kink on the short 5/16 line. You want to get it so it runs in just alongside the seatbelt bracket, and that's when you know you have your orientation correct. Loosen this up a little bit. Slide that in place. Nice and tight. Then we can take the top part of the neck, feed that back through the outside here. Push it into place. You'll know how far to go because there's actually a little lip, a little step right here on the filler neck, and it's going to run into the edge of the hose, and that's how you know you've gone all the way to full depth. Now I will tighten that top hose clamp. Okay, that is secure. We'll reinstall the rubber trim. It's in the opposite order that we took it out. There it goes. Cool. Everybody's in place. Put the gas cap back on for now, just so we're not breathing any fumes in the garage. And now with that in place, we're going to feed the 3/8 breather hose underneath the cross support here above the tank and down and out this gap right next to the intake duct. Try to get this thing to lay nice and flat. Feed that towards the front of the car where it's going to meet the front passenger tank. Okay, with that installed, we're going to put in the ball valve assembly. To install the ball valve bracket assembly, we're going to remove the front screw here on the lower door pivot. We're going to connect that 5/16 hose coming off of the filler neck to the ball valve before we install this. Make our lives a little easier. Now I have a little bit of silicone spray. I've seen guys use Windex or just muscle up and make it happen. The goal is just to use something that will evaporate so that the connection does become nice and tight and sealed over time. Okay. With that installed, that bolt goes back in. That's nice and tight. Double check that it's secure. Now we're going to want to feed that 5/16 hose down the same path that we did the 3/8. Undoing any kinks in it so it lays nice and flat. We're going to feed this under the 3/8 hose as we pass forward. And the reason for that is the 5/16, the height from front to rear isn't as critical because it's a pressure line. It's the fuel leaving the tank and going, or leaving the EXR tank and going into the factory tank. But this 3/8 line, we want to try to keep a continuous downhill from this high point all the way to the tank there. That way the vent stays free of fluid and can function properly. So make sure that guy's sitting on top here where it passes underneath this cross support. And then as we go forward, we're going to kind of continue that in the next steps where this stays up high and nice and flat. Okay. With that routed, we're going to throw a few zip ties on it. For securing this with zip ties and getting the routing, what we're trying to do is come all the way forward to this front bar in as straight a line as possible. And we're going to run along the front bar here and then turn back at this low point over the top of the strap. And the reason we're trying to get this kind of routing, the trim plate that sits over this has a recess in it right around here. And that recess will apply pressure to these hoses if we run them down the center. So we're trying to keep them forward to keep them away from the recess so we're not unnecessarily compressing these hoses. As we pass by the fuel pump and underneath the bracket, we want to secure it to something solid. We're just trying to prevent bounce here. And then here, we can use this same tab that the harness is picking up off of. And then by running the zip tie right here, not only are we stabilizing it off of that same support, we're adding a little bit of distance between the hoses and the cross support itself so that we don't chafe in the future. And if you want to be super cool, right here as we're running parallel so that we don't get into this edge, we can do a zip tie standoff. So I'll do this guy. We won't tighten it all the way down. And then between the zip tie, between the hoses and the chassis, we're going to come perpendicular to that first zip tie around the whole outside, tighten that down. And that is going to ensure that the hoses can never get up into the chassis here. With all of that done, we'll trim off the excess. That way if you get back in here, you're not cutting yourself. And you don't have all these danglies floating around. That is installed. Route that nice and tight. Clean. Got the routing the way we want. And we are moving to the passenger front seat. Next up, we're going to take the second coupling hose Slide that over the breather tube, or balance tube, I should say, all the way till this edge is flush. That way we got lots of real estate. Get our hose clamps in place. The one last thing we need to do actually before we drop this tank in, the outside corner of this trim piece needs to come off about 500 thousandths or a ½ inch back. Now, what I like to do is actually trim it perfectly square with this corner, just so it looks like it was done on purpose. That trimmed off. We're gonna sand on this thing. You can file it or you can leave it. We just wanna make it look clean. Boy, it looks like it's all on purpose still. Take the passenger tank, set that straight in. Make sure to feed this transfer hose into the inside of the passenger tank. As you drop it in place, now with the tank in place, we can slide that coupling back over and get our hose clamps. Tight. And tight. Quick note as you look straight down, I've gotten this tight, and I should point out, if you look all the way down here, you can see this cross brace. We want to make sure as we tighten this that the tank is actually just outside of this cross brace, so the tank isn't sitting on this. And I'm calling it a cross brace. It's a bracket, just outside the bracket. So all of that is good. Take a quick sec now that we know our distances are good. And we'll make sure to tighten this hose clamp the rest of the way. Okay, now we can bring our breather hose from the driver's side, attached to the driver's side tank. Bring that across, just in front of the balance tube. And again, I'm going to use a little bit of dry silicone to help me put this on. That connects to the breather hose on the passenger tank. Now those two are connected. We're going to leave this connection for last after we've reinstalled the seat frame, just so we know we get the routing right. Same thing with the 5/16, even though it's easy enough to do it now. Once this seat frame is in, it adds some extra height, and we want to make sure we get the routing right. So let's just leave those somewhere where we know. That way it reminds us. And we're going to move on to putting the strap on this guy and then putting in the wiring harness. Okay. Drop that strap in place. And again, we're going to tighten the underside of that after we get done with all this install. To start for the wiring harness, I'm going to open the cubby here, take the box out, turn that 180 degrees, and really all we're trying to do is get light down into the space. And if you look down in here, you can see the ground right there that we're going to, and the power is directly under here. Those are easier accessed from the underside. So what we'll start with is we're going to pick a spot for our switch. I just like, for visibility's sake from the driver, that we're over on this side. You can put it wherever you want. I think I'm going to go with this compartment. To do that, from the bottom or the top or the sides, you just reach in and pry that out. This can get discarded. You don't need this guy anymore. We're going to feed our harness through you reach around from the backside, you'll find that you can actually grab the harness almost immediately. See how we're pulling it out here? And then we'll clip this in place. Yeah, we're upside down. Make sure the switch is right side up where you can read the writing. And this just pushes in until you hear those snaps. It's in place. With that done, the next step is we're going to route the ground and power eyelets up to those terminals we just showed you. One of the really, really cool parts now that we're doing this, and I should mention this, is because we have the battery kill switch now connected, we can actually reach over and turn that off so that we're not worried about live power here. So Max, if you would. She's already off.
It's off.
Ah, gotcha. Cool. So the good news there is this is dead. It's not live power. We're not worried about the terminals, so we can jump in there and pull those off with some 10 millimeters. Okay, nut off. Take the power lead off. I think I pointed to this one. We're actually coming here. With both of these, we found it's actually a little bit nicer if we put the AGM wiring harness eyelets underneath the factory. Works a little bit better with the shape of the factory cables. Okay, those are installed. Factory back on. And nuts back on. Nice and snug. And double check. Okay, both are snug. Don't forget to put that positive cable. Oh, I think I broke this. Make sure to get that positive cable boot over the top so we're not going to have any issues in the future with shorts, at least from that connection. Okay, with both of those tight, now we route the harness. Now to route the harness, we're going to take the entirety, or the remaining portion I should say, and feed it inside of the cables that are passing through the firewall and out into the front of the car. That way the harness ends up really close to this factory harness, if you can see it running down here. The reason we're trying to do that is when this side trim goes back in, there's a compartment right here, and you can see it outlined by this portion of the other side. We cannot have the harness anywhere in this area, otherwise this trim won't go back in. So we're setting this in the middle. We're going to put a zip tie on that guy to hold it in place. And then the harness is going to run down along the side. We're going to pass just outside of here. Because if you feel on the other side, the side trim doesn't actually come flush to this. It sticks out a bit. So that gives us a little bit of room to pass right through here. Just double check that we're down below that height. Then we can get a zip tie here between the holes. And secure that in place. Now you'll see, you just connect the passenger side here. We're going to feed this above the frame for the center console and below the intake so it gets over to the driver's side. And then we're going to take this whole program, throw another zip tie on it so we're strain relieving everything right here to this center console frame. Okay, that nice and secured. No tight corners, nothing's landing on any sharp edges. We can trim the excess off these three. Real careful when you're trimming in the dark. It would really suck to cut your wiring harness. Okay, that all looks good. We can connect the driver's side now. Reach up in there, you should be able to feel the harness that you passed through. You're going to take your connector here. Okay. That guy connected. We're going to throw another zip tie as a strain relief on. I think this time we're going to go from the harness to the vent that's on this tank. It's easy to get to. Basically just trying to take the load off of where the harness goes into the fuel pump drop-in. Okay, next step. We are back underneath. We need to put these straps on so we can secure the tanks in place before the function test. To do that, we're going to start with these guys that have 2 holes and the guy that's kind of got like a funny shape. And those go up here on the front. Okay, with the front strap installed, we're going to install the back. Going to work around this transverse tube. Push that up into place, like so, and then we're going to put the nut on. Oh yeah, she's good there. Both clamps are tight. Tank is solid. Go ahead and repeat that on the driver's side. Driver's side is tight. Wiggle test good. Now we go out and do a function test. We are back up top, almost ready for our function test. Just need to set this guy back in place. So that we know how to route these like we mentioned. Okay, with that sitting roughly in place, we're going to go 5/16 first. It's coming by the duct over the frame, and it's going to end here. We have a little extra material here, so we're going to size this. And trim it. Nice and snug. We're coming with our 3/8 on top. Getting that continuous drop we talked about. Size that right here to our T-fitting. A lube to help us. Right there. Now the vent system is complete. What we want to do so these things don't bounce around is tighten around this tube. That'll hold in place right there. Put one here so they get a little strength off each other. I'm going to do one last one here. That way the two support each other down here as well. The other thing this is doing is putting the zip tie between the fuel hose and the coupling below it. Okay. Tight, tight, good, tight. That's tight, tight, tight. That's run. Connections are tight. Those are tight. Everybody's installed. All right, now we need to put the fuse in the system. Comes out of the hardware bag. We want to put that in now, not before. That way we don't have any chance of messing anything up. Fuse into the fuse holder. We are good there. Switch on the battery switch if you would. No sparks, always a good sign. And then the next thing we want to do, I did put a few gallons in that off camera, so we have fuel on both sides. We're going to turn the switch on, feel to make sure both pumps are running, and then we're going to go back, make sure it's spraying. And as we're doing both those things, we're also looking to make sure we don't see any leaks anywhere. So first thing, we want to see the light illuminate. You can see that. Now we're going to check, make sure the pumps are running. So I can both hear them and I can feel them. So that's good. Come back here. Now, one quick point, just in case it was overlooked, is the ball valve assembly. You want to make sure the handle is in line with the hose, which this one is. So that way we know we're going to get fuel coming out of the spray nozzle there. Go ahead and give that a try. And you can see it's coming out, so that is all good. Last little bit before we put everything back together. Let's just give a quick once over. All of our connections, all of our hoses, make sure there's no leaks, make sure we didn't miss in case the hoses are running over anything sharp. Everything looks good there. All good back through here. No leaks. Harness is good. Everything looks really good, so we can start going back together. With the tank installed and the function test done, the last thing that we need to do is trim the rear under seat panel and the right rear quarter panel. We're going to start here on what would be the driver's side. We're trimming this portion to gain access to the battery switch. There's two ways you can do this. Either right here at the radius, you can trim all the way across here. That's going to keep this top cover here hiding the battery switch. That way it's a little bit more of a security feature. This customer isn't as concerned with it. So we're actually going to trim around this entire lug right here and straight down, as you can see there. Going this way, what will happen is you'll actually expose the entire battery switch, making it a little bit easier to get to, but obviously you don't have the hidden aspect that you would the other way, so you decide what works best for you. Now you can trim this with dikes, cutters, tin snips, hacksaw. We have some air tools, so I'm going to knock it out that way. Key is just to take your time so that you have a nice clean finish. Once you got that trimmed out, you can either use a file trimmed out with no major gotchas. That trimmed out, and we'll use a little alcohol on here to get the paint pen off. Okay, so the next section to trim is just a portion of the distance between my two fingers in this area between here and here. The reason we're trimming this is because the battery tray protrudes into this space further and will actually collide with this portion of the trim panel. So we want to get rid of that. That way we can screw the whole thing back down together. So if we flip this guy over, on the back side, as you can see by the red box we've drawn, we're going to be cutting a section of the trim piece out here, running just past the radiuses on each side of this section and about halfway up the width. Now you can trim this entire face out if you want, but we're going to trim out, as you see with the red line, to keep the opening a little bit smaller. So we're putting holes on either end so that we can get whatever our cutting device is in there. In this case, a little air saw. Whether you use a file or a sander, if you want to really get these things straight, you can jump in there and do that too. Trimmed out, straight, no burrs. For anyone that's been asking, what the heck is that thing he's using? This is a deburring tool. They only cost a few bucks. I'm sure you can find them on Amazon. Do a quick Google search. They are handy in so many different situations. For a job like this, they save you a ton of time. So there's that guy. All right, we got the driver's side trim for the switch. We got the driver's side trimmed for the battery box. Now we need to flip this thing around. We need to do the last trimming, and this is for the ball valve. So this is on the passenger rear. The ball valve is going to live right here, and the hoses actually pass right through this area. So what we're going to do is come in 500 thousandths from this edge, and we're going to cut a straight line all the way to the red line that we've drawn on the trim panel here. We're going to turn 90 degrees and follow that red line down around the edge of the panel, cutting off this entire section. Come in 500. As you can see about the gap there, it's about double the thickness of this ridge. And we want to follow that all the way up to here. So we'll use that as our guide. And again, we're cutting all the way to the red line here, so please disregard the silver line you see on screen. Okay, that guy is trimmed up. The last small thing that we need to do, this is the right rear quarter panel where the ball valve comes out to pass through to here. We actually need to trim this area out to make room for that. So the way that we're going to trim this panel is we're going to use this corner of the large hole as a reference. This is flat, so we're going to follow that same plane, come off of here, and then we're going to go back 2 inches from here, around the corner, essentially. So we're 2 inches off of this hole. We're coming up perpendicular to this guy. And then we're running parallel to this face here. So again, using the top of the hole as a reference, that's our starting point. We'll trim off this side. We'll trim 2 inches this way, and then go down. And you can do this with the same dikes you've been using all day, or if you have something fancier. Clean up that cut a little bit right here. Okay, that is trimmed. That is trimmed. We'll take these sharp corners off. With the rear quarter trimmed and this trimmed, the entire car can go back together in the order that you took it apart. And remember, the really, really important part of this, so that you don't get your butt kicked, is when you start in on this front seat frame, put these 2 center bolts in first. If you do that, you're going to be able to wiggle the frame to get the bolts in. Don't tighten them, though, until you get all the rest of the bolts installed. And that's it. All you got to do now is put her back together and then go further than you've ever gone before. Hey, we know you're going to enjoy your new purchase. Thank you very much. If you do enjoy your Pro R EXR tank as much as we think you will, please leave us a review. Or maybe let a friend know who's suffering the same problem. Your words might be the exact thing they need to hear in order to find this solution. So share with a friend, leave a review, pretty much tell anybody who'll listen. All right, well, till next time, thank you again, and we'll see you on the trail.